Hello and welcome to Talking Templars with myself, Tony McMahon.
And me, Dr. Steve Tibble.
Now, today we're going to be talking about the Assassins. Some of you, no doubt, have played Assassin's Creed, admit it. And we're going to be talking about the relationship between the Assassins, the real relationship between the Assassins and the Knights Templar. But first of all, just to say, I'm a TV historian. You may have caught me on the History Channel, Discovery, other channels. What are you, Steve?
Many things, thank you, Tony. But for these purposes, I'm an academic historian specialising in the Crusades and the medieval Eastern Mediterranean.
So you've written a book on the Assassins. So why don't you tell us about the book you've written?
The subject of the book kind of writes itself. It was such a wonderfully easy book to write because it's two groups that are very close to my heart. They were strangely close to many people's hearts, which is why they were so dangerous. But the Assassins and the Templars are such extreme, crazy groups in their own right. But each of them had their own stories, and they've been able to build up legends that have reverberated through history. So this is very much a book that wrote itself. But the most extraordinary thing about it, I think, was the way in which these two groups, which you kind of think shouldn't really have much in common, actually had a huge amount in common and bounced off each other for nearly 200 years.
And there is a kind of suggestion that the Templars, and this is something I think their detractors said more than anything, that the Templars may have been influenced by the Assassins, or the whole idea of the Templars may have been something that came out of the Assassin playbook, and that their theology, I know some people try and say that the theology of the Templars was informed by, I know we're getting into conspiracy theory territory, but is there any suggestion that the very concept of the Knights Templar kind of replicated or mirrored the Assassins, or is that way too fanciful?
As an academic, I'd say it's way too fanciful, but I have to say there is... at a higher level, there are such clear parallels. I wouldn't say there was direct influence, but there was certainly very intimate parallels between the two. I mean, we can talk about it in a minute, but they had a very similar kind of methodology. You know, the way they operated was very similar. They had very similar objectives. Their strategic approach was very similar. They both had ideological similarities in a broad sense, you know, in as much as they were both the kind of extreme ends of their own religious communities. And they both came and left the stage at the same time, even though they're still with us today. We're still having this conversation. But the Assassins and the Templars were both very finite, and they both entered, the stage of the Middle East at about the same time, at the beginning of the 12th century, and both exited towards the end of the 13th century.
And I think just to kind of almost kind of summarize for the benefit of anybody who doesn't know who the Assassins were, we're talking about a bunch of guys in the Middle East who, during the time of the Crusades, or just before, and as you say, during the period of the Crusades, who basically they carry daggers, they operate as kind of lone wolves, to use modern terrorist terminology. They're kind of the medieval suicide bombers in a way, but they go and they assassinate mainly Muslim, and they are Muslims themselves, but they assassinate mainly Muslim, but some Christian political rulers, military rulers. I mean, what are they doing? What are they about? I mean, are they crazies? Do they have an agenda? You're just commenting on who the hell were these guys?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. I mean, you've raised a lot there. I mean, clearly they're extremists, I'd say, rather than terrorists. I mean, I think as a word, terrorist is so loaded that it almost shuts down discussion.
Yeah.
And it's so pejorative that it implies you've come to the answer before looking at the evidence. And I think they would very much say that they were people who were committed to their cause and prepared to die to defend it, in the same way as the Templar Knight would say about Christianity and protecting the Christian communities of the Middle East. But I think from an assassin's perspective, they saw themselves as, and this is a quote from Sinan, who one of the main characters in Assassin's Creed, they saw themselves as oppressed and not oppressors. He actually wrote that in a letter to Saladin. And they would very much see themselves as being on the brunt end of persecution, that they were perceived, particularly by their Muslim neighbours, who were Sunnis primarily, as heretics. And even their old Shiite chums back in Egypt, within the Fatimid Empire, did not rate them, and they used to kill each other.
And I think as well, just to kind of cover how they were set up. So you've got this guy Hassani Saba, great name, and he is a kind of Shiite scholar. There is this division in Islam. We won't go too much into the theology of it, but there's a division between Sunni, Shia Muslims, still exists today. Shia today is mainly Iran and part of Iraq and Syria, but then actually there was a Shia empire ruling out of Egypt, the Fatimids, and they are a kind of, the assassins were a kind of a subset of a subset of a subset within Shia Islam, and a particularly kind of almost mystical subset. And Hassani Saba was actually a scholar. I believe he studied in Cairo, so he's a serious scholar, but he develops this very kind of mystical version of Islam, where there's layers of meaning within Islam and so on. And then he develops as well this fanatical group who are going to implement his version of Islam. I mean, is that a kind of fair description?
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely. There is a defensive element to it, as in, if you're that hugely unpopular, you do have a defensive element to it. I think with Hassan, there was a particularly radical element because he's based in Persia. Persia has been overrun by Sunni Turks, so his brand of Islam has a kind of nationalist revolt to it as well. It's kind of a bit like Vietnam War. These guys are the kind of people on the ground, popular support, fighting against a foreign invader, and certainly that was part of the trigger. One of the things that perhaps gave the assassins a full sense of their own capabilities was that almost their first hit was against one of the main leaders of Turkic Persia, and it succeeded so well. It made them feel, wow, this is great. We're a tiny group, but we can really leverage power through the power of the dagger.
Yes.
We don't need 50,000 cavalrymen.
And I'm intrigued. This whole thing about the power of the dagger, which you talk about, and it does. These kind of mysterious figures. They're operating solo, but they're sent out by Hassani Saba, who we refer to as the old man of the mountain. But we'll come to that in a moment. But they're sent out. They kind of remind me a bit in their modus operandi of, if you go back 1,000 years, of the kind of Jewish zealots, the Sicarii, wasn't it? They were dagger wielding. I mean, I'm sure they would not have appreciated. They may not have appreciated the comparison. They may have liked the comparison. I don't know. But this kind of idea of dagger wielding zealots, it wasn't original, but they had a kind of spin on it. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, and I think you touched on a very good point there, which is that it would be nice and easy to describe the assassins as the people who invented terrorism, but I think that's sort of a facile comparison, really. I mean, basically, it's political murder has existed since the beginning of time, and I don't think the Sicarii invented it any more than the assassins did. But I think where you're absolutely spot on is that they both used that as their main lever. That was the main instrument of their foreign policy, such as it was, and they both did a fabulous job at putting that into practice.
Quick Templar ad break here to tell you all about Assassins and Templars. You've played Assassin's Creed, but now meet the real assassins, as Dr. Steve Tibble tells you all about their history and the fights with the Knights Templar. Buy Assassins and Templars today at Amazon, Waterstones, and other outlets.
And they take this castle at a place called Alamut, which I assume is a kind of HQ. What I think what a lot of people are intrigued by down the centuries has been their kind of training program, which seems to involve showing. For a start, we're told that the old man of the mountain could literally command them to throw themselves from a great height and to certain death, and they do it, and so on. And that there was this whole thing about being drugged up, being transported somehow to some kind of paradise in their drugged up state with lots of women who were available for sex, basically. Then they were brought back to a sober state and told, you'll have that one day so long as you kill people, etc. Now, this account of the training program does come from Marco Polo. So my two questions are, is Marco Polo fibbing, making it all up? Is it true? And also, yeah, I mean, tell us, what do we make of this rather strange training program?
Yeah, I do always think of Monty Python with the assassins, because there's two aspects of it. One is the life of Brian, when you've got this whole splitters thing, because as you say, they're a fraction of a faction of a faction. But there is also the sense that, one day, lad, all this will be yours from the Holy Grail. And the idea that there's this huge promise and that they are somehow patsies and they're drugged up, sad losers who are fed this kind of line is deeply insulting, I think. And it was meant to be. So a lot of this stuff, the fact that we're calling them assassins or hashashin, which implies, drug use, major drug use, that arose from their Sunni enemies, who habitually described them as scum, rabble, basically junkie scum. And so the fact that they were called hashashin does imply drug use, but it also implies scum in a more general sense. But it's also a pejorative way of explaining why they're so devoted. And actually, I don't think it's true at all. Because if you think about it, you're James Bond, you're Jason Bourne, you've got a really elaborate hit to carry out. You probably have to insinuate yourself into somebody's household. You have to speak their language. You have to be totally believable. Now, the idea that you're doing all this over a period of months in a completely, drugged up state full of narcotics is laughable. I mean, the last thing you need is to be halfway through a hit and then think, oh wow, I could really do with a Mars bar now. Or if you're an assassin, you need all your wits about you. So I think that was an insult, but it was a double insult because it allowed their opponents to denigrate the commitment of the guys who were carrying that out. Whereas in fact, like the Templars, I think an assassin member of a hit squad, they call them fideus. Most people in the assassin community were just peasants, merchants, lawyers, or what have you, in the same way as most people in the Templar community wouldn't be brother knights. But they were very devoted people. You do not need them to be off their heads on drugs to explain what they did.
So do you think, just on the Marco Polo question, is he making it up?
I don't think he is. I think he was in the right place. So he's 13th century. He's travelling into the Mongol court. The Mongols have had a lot of dealings with the assassins. In fact, the Mongols eventually were the ones who destroyed them in Persia. And he would have been speaking to a lot of people. Interestingly, though, most of those people would have been Sunni Muslims. And I think what Marco Polo says resonates very closely with a lot of sources we have from the 12th century. From the Muslim side, Christian side.
So he doesn't actually get to visit the training camp. He's hearing this from secondary.
Absolutely. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the main themes of his account tie in pretty well with a lot of the other ones. And they do talk of the old man of the mountain being able to control these malleable youths, giving them potions, in brackets drugs, giving them access to sex and so on. So I think that was a trope, but it was a trope that was ancient. It was already from the previous century. I don't think Dear Marco was making it up.
And I mean, it is interesting that if you look at, as I say, I kind of had a decade working on counter-extremism programs as kind of home office for my sins, and that was all very ISIS related. When ISIS were trying to recruit young people here in Britain and other countries. And sex was actually one of the selling, for a puritanical Salafi jihadi movement, they were promising young girls, you'll have a glamorous jihadi fighter to be with. And of course they were saying to the guys, and you'll be able to basically rape enslaved women, which they did. There's the Yazidi women, for example. So sex has always been a selling point, unfortunately, for fanatical movements. It doesn't seem to stretch credulity that sex may have been part of the assassin. Obviously, they didn't get to have it for real. They had virtual sex with the promise of the real thing later on.
Yeah, I have to say that I don't know of any evidence of that. I mean, actually, and ironically, as far as we know, these assassin garrisons, for instance, in these castles were very largely male, often totally male.
Yeah.
The leaders tended to send their families away because that was the source of weakness. Guys weren't allowed to have women. It was a very austere lifestyle, in the same way as the Templar Knights were supposedly celibate as well. So I think the idea is possible, but in reality, that idea comes from their enemies. There's very little of that to be seen with them.
One of the things that you point out is that certainly for the first period of their operation, they're killing mainly Muslims. They're killing Sunni and Shia Muslims, Seljuk Turks who are Sunnis, Fatimids who are Shias. And then it's only later on they actually get around to start killing some Christians. But they seem to see enemy number one is the proximate enemy is fellow Muslims, and then Christians later on. And the Christians even see them as potential allies, and they do ally on occasion. I mean,
yeah, absolutely, very much.
Explain
so.
that to me, because
Well, it does. It's a good point, but it does have its huge internal logic, which is you have to look at who hates a heretic most. Well, it's somebody from your own religion, and from a Shiite perspective, they were seen as splitters, but from a Sunni Muslim perspective, they were seen as massively heretical. And there were certainly periods in the 12th century when the assassins really played into that. There was a time when they destroyed mosques, when they said that Sharia law no longer needed to be obeyed, when people were drinking wine and so on. And ironically, they would kill their fellow assassins who refused to drink wine and still wanted to go to the mosque. So, they are quite extreme. And they certainly never made much effort to, make friends. It was always make enemies and kill them rather than influence them. And also once you understand that, you can see that an alliance with the Christians isn't out of the window at all. There were periods in the 12th century and the 13th century when they were in talks with the kings of Jerusalem, and they were really cozying up together. Ironically, because the assassins are, unlike other Muslims, they were in some ways much more open-minded. They were much more interested in philosophy, Greek philosophy, the ancient world, than your average Catholic or your average Sunni Muslim.
And this was an accusation often made by Sunnis against certain branches of Shia Islam, that it had been contaminated by Kabbalistic Judaism and Greek philosophy and Manichaeism. And I think it was probably a slur, but it was the idea that these Muslims had innovated, and of course innovation is bida, I think is the word in Arabic, is completely forbidden, so they went heretical. But then they as I said, the assassins turn their attention to Christians, and they kill what is basically, the guy is basically the king of Jerusalem. He hasn't been crowned yet, but let's not be pedantic, he is the king of Jerusalem, Conrad of Montferrat. And apparently they've been posing as monks for a while in the Bishop of Tyre's retinue. This was a long term, and there was more than one of them, I think, on that occasion. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, very often there were more than one. The first attempted hit on Saladin, I think there were up to 13 of the guys there. I mean, there were never many of these hitmen, the Fideus, but they were used sparingly. And you're absolutely right with Conrad. There's a big mystery about that, because so many people wanted him dead. And we know who killed him, but we don't know why they killed him. And there's an enduring conspiracy about whether it was Richard the Lionheart, whether it was Saladin. And interestingly, again, you're into the realms of Assassin's Creed. These are big characters in Assassin's Creed, and they're larger-than-life characters. So everybody wants them to be involved. And even at the time, both of them were put forward as potential paymasters. We know the assassins wielded the knives. But in reality, there's a much more, as always, I tend to believe the boring solution, because I don't like conspiracies.
It's never boring, Steve. Never.
I just believe that human beings are so incompetent that they can't manage a good conspiracy.
But they could have been daggers for hire, basically.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think they definitely were for hire. And I think that's pretty clear. Somebody who wasn't an assassin hired the assassins to do it.
Yeah.
The issue is who, and the issue is whether the assassins were actually touting for money and wanted to be paid for something that they wanted to do anyway, which was often the case. And I think in this case, the one feature that's often overlooked is the most boring one, which is there was an ongoing commercial dispute between the assassins and Conrad
Yeah.
to do with his confiscation of some
He pounded
some
a ship
goods.
or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's always the dull stuff that'll get you in the end.
Yeah.
But it rankled with the assassins.
Yeah.
Conrad thought he'd got one over with them. He thought it was all over. Nothing's ever over for the assassins. You know, they can sulk about it for 20 years, and then there'll be somebody knifing you in the back in a dark alleyway.
Yeah.
And they never forgive. They never forget. And I strongly suspect that it was that commercial dispute that really pissed the assassins
I mean,
off.
it kind of smacks a bit of organised crime. Mind you, everybody seems to have been an organised criminal, basically, in the Middle Ages. It's hard to kind of... You can't really pin it on... You can't call the assassins organised criminals when you've got Crusaders and various Saracen operatives as well. But it does smack a bit of... These are gangs, basically, carving out turf and...
Yeah, absolutely. And the big players carve out their turf, with huge armies. The assassins carve out their turf. Their policy is implemented with daggers. And I think what they did was they didn't like Conrad. They touted the hit around. And I don't believe Richard was involved. It doesn't ring true. It was actually not in his interest to do it. No. It was in Saladin's interest. I suspect they probably got some money from Saladin, but they may well have wanted to do it. I think they did want to do it. They may well have been about to do it anyway. Yeah. And you find several times they're getting paid, and particularly by Saladin. And a decade earlier, there's a lot of evidence that Saladin paid them to take a hit out on one of his enemies in Aleppo, who happened to be Muslim. But I don't think religion is at the core of this. It's more about politics and money.
Ever wanted to know more about the history of the Knights Templar, from their origins through to the end, and a few of the conspiracy theories in between? Then buy the Knights Templar History and Mystery by Tony McMahon. It's available on Amazon, Waterstones, and other outlets. Buy it to get a comprehensive look at the Knights Templar.
And then we have the kind of mysterious incident where, as you said, they are cozying up the Christians. They have a kind of a party of assassins go to Jerusalem. They're chatting away. Everything's going well. They're going back home, and the Templars kill them. Now, there's a one-eyed Templar, I believe, involved in this. Why do the Templars, and they get in trouble with their own side, the Templars, for doing this? Why did the Templars attack an assassin diplomatic party that had been getting on very well with the Christian authorities in Jerusalem, and then the Templars intervened to scupper it, to make sure that there's no rapprochement between the assassins? I mean, a lot of questions were asked at the time. Do you have any answers?
I do, actually. Yeah. I mean, actually, the Templars are little scamps, and they did have the nearest thing that approximated to a hitman themselves. This guy Walter of Menil, who's a sort of larger than life character. I mean, he's almost a cartoon character. He's got one eye. He's got scars all over the place. He's really tough and mean. And he and his squad just go in and wipe out all the assassin diplomats just at the moment when they're about to come into some kind of rapprochement and close alliance with the Christians. King Amalric, who's the king of Jerusalem at the time, has heritage of bad blood with the Templars. I mean, they surrendered one of his castles without asking, and he was famously irritable anyway. He was a very, very difficult man himself. And he hung 10 Templars. All the Templars in command of that garrison got hung, and that wasn't long before that. The Templars, like the assassins, never forgave. And the other issue they have is that they are neighbours and effectively landlords to the assassins. They both own lots of castles in the mountains of Lebanon. And the Templars are so crazy that they habitually extort money from the assassins.
I was going to say, they actually managed to extract tribute from the assassins, don't they? Which is quite an achievement, isn't it?
Absolutely. Over 2 centuries, yeah. I mean, they are so tough. They're the only people crazy enough to extort money from the world's most dangerous killers. And the reason they can do that is because, like the assassins, they're a corporation. They're not vulnerable to the idea of single human death. They don't have families to worry about. If you kill the master of the Templars, okay, they won't be happy, but there'll be a new one on the following day. They're impervious to that kind of blackmail, and they used to kick the assassins around and extorted a lot of money from them.
I mean, in the end, the kind of nemesis of the assassins turns out to be the Mongols, doesn't it? Tell us a bit about the Mongol assassin relationship, because the Mongols are the kind of, they're the variable that enters into the whole Middle Eastern equation during the Crusades. Nobody was expecting the Mongols to turn up, and they really do change everything. And they're pretty devastating impact on the assassins.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're thinking that that the Templars are aliens and the assassins are alien versus predators, I mean, really the kind of the Mongols are the ultra predator coming into the region. And originally, when they first arrived in the early 1250s, the assassins thought, oh, this might be helpful. And actually, the Christians thought that as well. Anybody who's killing this many Sunni Muslims can't be all bad. So they had this kind of rather twisted hope that the Mongols were going to be great guys and they could be great mates. In reality, no one's a great mate of the Mongols. All they ever wanted was, they didn't really have allies. What they wanted was submission.
Yeah.
The assassins didn't see it that way. So you have this kind of two implacable forces. The assassins reacted to a rebuff from the Mongols by making the mistake of killing one of their generals, which had always worked for them in the past, because with family firms, you kill one person, you've kind of decapitated it. With the Mongols, you're dealing with a much more ruthless beast, and the Mongols just go mental, and they basically wipe out the assassins in Persia. And we can talk about that in more detail in a later episode, but it was really apocalyptic what happened. And the assassins in Iran, modern Iran, never recovered.
Yeah.
The only people who could beat the Mongols were people who were even tougher and meaner, and that was the Mamluks.
Mamluks, yeah. And
particularly under Sultan Baybars. So they gave the Mongols a good kicking at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260.
Yeah.
And then after that, the assassins, again, they probably breathed a little sigh of relief, thinking, oh, great, things will go back to normal. But in fact, they just had an even worse master, and Baybars, Sultan Baybars, just gave them a massive kicking, and they became his creatures after that.
One thing we haven't touched on, which you touch on the book, just to kind of, I was going to say end on a more buoyant note, but it's actually ending on a more murderous note. But is the point you make that the assassins didn't always get it their own way. Some of their attempts at murder actually met with resistance. I believe you talk about one example. Was it Edward I who? Yeah, there's some
fabulous. I love it when the assassins fail, not because I want them to particularly. It's none of my business, but I like to see that they're human. And there was one, as you mentioned, there was a fabulous incident, which actually says more about Edward I, really. So an assassin had inveigled his way into Edward's household, which shows how wonderful they were.
He was on crusade at the time.
He was on crusade, 1270, out in the Holy Land. He wasn't King Edward then; he was Prince Edward.
And this is the man for anybody who's forgotten. This is the king who's going to take on Braveheart. Just to get your cultural references.
Very much so. The famous Longshanks, and he was famous with reason. So this guy, ironically, this assassin, managed to get into his household as a spy. So that was ironic. They recruited an enemy spy as a spy. And then when he was totally trusted, he used to have one-on-one meetings with Edward and used to give him reports on what was happening in the political and military sphere. So one night he woke Edward up in his chamber. Edward's dressed. We actually have a good insight into medieval underwear here. He's wearing his sort of long nightie, very fetching. His pregnant wife is asleep in bed. Edward gets up, lets in his spy to take a briefing, and instead of a briefing, he gets a dagger. So the assassin, lunges at him, takes a high blow, and here this is where dear Eddie Longshanks really comes into his own, because he is fabulous. He's half asleep, he's unarmored, he's got unarmed. He parries the blow, so the dagger, which is poisoned, goes down into his leg, so he's bleeding from his leg. But even poisoned and bleeding, he then punches the assassin in the face so hard that he knocks him unconscious. And then while he's down on the ground, he takes the guy's dagger and stabs him to death in the face with his own dagger. Ironically, the Templars and the Hospitallers then come in and help to try and relieve some of the poisoning effect. And Edward survives. So it's even with a defenseless man taken unawares, the assassin wasn't able to do it. And there are other great ones. There's one incident where nearly 100 assassins stormed a castle, managed to get it at a time when the garrison was out partying, and they made the mistake of underestimating the females population in the citadel, and they started negotiating with them, cozying up, thinking, ha ha ha, we've already won, we can afford to be nice, and the women held them off long enough until the army got back and absolutely wiped out the assassins.
These assassins needed to be told about Eleanor of Aquitaine and women like that who you don't mess with.
No, and you don't mess with. This was in a town called Chazar, and you don't mess with the women of Chazar either.
Right.
They really got their own back.
I think just to kind of, as you say, just to bring this particular episode, I mean, we'll come back to the assassins because we can't leave them alone. But of course, there's how they're portrayed in popular culture, and we've got the hugely successful Assassin's Creed franchise. My partner plays it all the time and is attached to that screen. But interestingly, in that one, and I'm always fascinated by this, the way in which the Templars in some popular culture are the good guys and sometimes they're the bad guys. Now, with Assassin's Creed, the Templars are the bad guys and the Assassins are the good guys. It's an interesting take. It's based, I believe, on a novel written back in the 1930s. I think it was called Alamut from memory. But what do you think of this kind of the way that we're almost still trying to figure out whether the Templars were the good guys or the bad guys, and in relation to the Assassins with Assassin's Creed, how we've managed to turn the Assassins into freedom fighters, and why there's that appeal? What does it say about our culture today that we've turned the Assassins into our friends and heroes?
No, absolutely. Well, that's a mirror of ourselves. We live in grey times, don't we? No black, no white. And those two groups did see things in black and white, but we don't. So interestingly, I think the way that Assassin's Creed has been created, and it's a wonderful game, but it's also a wonderful reflection of our own ambivalence. So the people you think might be good are bad, the people you think might be bad are actually good. In the game, Sinan actually turns out to be a covert Templar as well. I mean, there's all, nothing is what you think it is. So it's a very good way of bringing it into the modern world, where we've been brought up in an environment where it's no longer clear who the gooders and the baddies are, and the Western world in particular is flagellating itself with, desperately trying to prove how awful it is. So it does play into that. But I think what really struck me, and I've always loved Assassin's Creed, and it's always been in my family, is the extent to which there is actually a historical grounding to this, that the Assassins and the Templars did have a relationship over 200 years. They did share an awful lot in common. They did bounce off each other, kill each other, pay money to each other. Things that I thought would have been totally made up were really based on some truth. And that's not to say that it's a history lecture, because clearly it isn't, and it doesn't pretend to be. It's a fantasy video game, but it does have an authentic look and feel and attachment to groups that had real historical lives.
So, of course, one of the things about Assassin's Creed is it taps into this idea as well of the Templars being much older, and the Assassins as well in this case, being much older than we think, being set up by shadowy forces and so on, which we are going to touch on in another episode about the origins of the Templars and also whether they're with us today. That's 2 episodes, in fact, will be coming up very shortly. But all good things must come to an end. So that's the end of our episode today on the Assassins. Now, if you've got any questions, comments, brickbats, whatever you want to throw at us, do it in the comments below, or any other way that you can think of to get hold of us. But in the meantime, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
And join us next time when we will have an episode on the mysterious origins of the Knights Templar, which I just touched on. Until then, non nobis domine.